Hello, everyone. Hopefully this thing will actually run at this point. Originally, this was supposed to be the first conversation Vaush had today, and it was concerning the Professor Flowers discourse that's been going on, and of course, it was with a quote-unquote indigenous advocate who I learned seconds ago from the chat was actually someone by the name, and I hope I don't butcher this, by the name of Morgan Kagesheongai? Kagesheongai? Something like that. Hi, Burned Water. Good evening to you. It's quite late here. What's the Sunday? Sorry, what's the thumbnail? What's the Sunday? I'm the Sunday. The thumbnail is... Oh, really? Nobody got this? It's from Firefly, like at the beginning when Wash is like with the toy dinosaurs. It's like, yes, this is a fertile land and we will thrive. We will rule over all this land and we will call it this land. That one, yeah. Anyways, to the point, because I am dead tired, so this may be ill-advised. Vaush has been talking to this person for, as far as I can ascertain, about an hour and a half. I don't know if we'll go through the whole thing, but we'll see if it's interesting. I have not listened to much of it at all. So, that's what we're doing tonight. Sound good? Okay.
Oh, you're still available? Okay. That works for me.
Let me know if the audio is okay.
Sec. All right, we're getting 2 calls today, lads. Let me edit the title back to what it was before.
Oh, I'm not going to fall asleep in stream. I have copious amounts of coffee.
Well, I was streaming anyway.
Extremely spicy Indian biryani burning me from the inside out, so I cannot sleep. What if Vaush falls asleep too? Then this will be a very cozy stream.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi there.
Howdy, howdy. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. Sorry about the time mix-up. It's no issue either way. You know, I'm just sitting here at the computer, so
yeah,
it doesn't change much
Same
of anything
here.
from my perspective. Yeah, would you like to introduce yourself to the class? It's a large and invisible
Absolutely.
classroom, but it is there.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Morgan Kagesheongai. I am an
Kagesheongai.
Anishinaabe Ojibwe
I'll remember
living in
that.
Southern Ontario. I am a full status Indian under the Indian Act of Canada, which means I have any and all rights associated with being a full status Indigenous persons in Canada. And just to give a bit of background context, one of the reasons why I felt like I might be able to opine on the discussion that we're going to have is because my reservation actually has received a parcel of land back from the federal government, as well as paid out a chunk of restitutions that went along with that. So that's about it. That's who I am.
Nice. That slaps. My chat humbly asks your pronouns out of respect.
She, her, or they, them is fine.
Okay. There you go, chat. We got... Quit spamming it. Awesome. Okay. So, I'll just say that I appreciated your email. Usually when I have conversations on issues like these, I'm talking to people who aren't really directly affected by that stuff, or whose investment in it is kind of an abstract intellectual or ethical concern, rather than something more immediate. And
Yes.
I thought the conversation that I had with Professor Flowers was really unproductive for a few reasons. I'm sure you're familiar with at least most of them.
Yes.
Right. It's the thing that bothered me the most is that I feel like sometimes the loudest advocates for indigenous issues online are also the worst and like most disingenuous ones.
Absolutely.
Where indigenous issues are like, because you'll have to forgive the internet terminology, but it's like it feels like a very virtue signaling thing sometimes to be very in
Yeah.
favor of
Oh, yeah.
decolonization, like yeah, pro land back. But then when it actually comes to talking about these issues and actually like reconciling, like sometimes it can get, I think, a little bit well, there's a clear dissonance. So that's my feeling on it. But like, what's your impression of all that?
So I tend to think about it in two types of ways. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt as often as I can, by thinking, okay, maybe it's just that they haven't, spent the time necessary to get everything together, and maybe they're just struggling with articulating the cause appropriately and that sort of thing. But every now and then you do meet people who say, or who do things like they are trying to use talking points about Indigenous authority, actualization, land back movements, all of these sort of things, not because they're banking on the knowledge that the general public is going to be just as ill informed as they are, and so they're kind of betting on this, like especially between the debate between Professor Flowers and Dr. Heemdout was where I noticed that Dr. Heemdout, as an immigrant, was somebody that was less informed than probably the majority of people who were. I think he's from Canada, right?
Dr.
I can't
Himda?
remember. Yeah,
I believe so.
but let's say he's from Canada, and so if he's immigrated here, there's a chance that his social circles and the way that our social structures kind of section us off, he's just not going to be as well informed in talking points about Indigenous land back movements. He's just not going to have the same kind of background knowledge on that as an actual Indigenous person might. And there's a chance, I don't want to say that this is how it was, but there's a chance that Professor Flowers knows that, because and is using those talking points because she knows that people aren't going to be able to call her out on it.
Hang on. She's using those talking points because she knows that people won't be able to. That's a weird read on that conversation. I mean, my read on that, of course, was that I don't think anybody in that conversation really had a good sense of how Indigenous land back works, but primarily that was due to the indifference of Dr. Heemdout, because for whatever reason he just hasn't made himself minimally conversant with that issue, despite it being the subject of the conversation. And Professor Flowers, again, for whatever reason, just didn't know much about land back, or didn't know how to talk about it. I don't know why you would even speculate as to whether or not this was some dastardly ploy to pull one over the ignorant masses. It also seems weirdly coddling to Dr. Heemdout. Like if you're gonna talk about this stuff, it kind of, especially if you're gonna go at this in a combative way, you need to know your stuff. It's just a weird off-color remark to make, I think.
Now, I don't know if that's actually what she did. I actually think she was probably just not as informed as she could have been, and was just kind of stumbling over the right articulations. And one of the ways that I saw that was when Dr. Heemdout had said, well, I'm an immigrant and I believe that everybody has a right to live where they live, which is an idea that I agree with. And so he says, well, why can't I just live where I live? And Professor Flowers says, well, because you're living on stolen land, and that land is still stolen. And that's also true. And both of these opinions are valid opinions to have.
But they're contradictory. If it's on stolen land, I mean, the direct implication of that is that you don't have a right to be on it. Like, there's a line in Rousseau that, again, I'm going on and on about Rousseau recently. It's only because I've been, plowing through Rousseau lately. But there's a line in Rousseau where he talks about somebody who, cultivates a territory and builds it up, all with his own hard labor, and he never had any involvement whatsoever in stealing this land from whoever occupied it before. Or I guess in this context he's talking about land that was common use, but it still applies here. And he can... And maybe he says, hey, I've got a right to this land. I settled here. I built all this stuff myself. But then somebody else could reply, yeah, well, who set the boundaries? Like, you don't suddenly have a right to stolen contraband just because you paid a thief for it. Right? Like if we're talking about like whether or not it's humane to remove people from their land, that's a separate question, or from where they live. That's a separate question. Whether they have the right to, that depends on a number of things. If the question is literally, if the question can be answered just by, well, they have a right to live where they live by dint of living there, that's deeply unsatisfying. By that logic, it's right is determined entirely by raw force, because that's how who got to live there ultimately got to live there. Does that make sense? I mean, Professor Flowers multiple times said indigenous people should be listened to on the issue. Should she at least culpable for that? I don't know what that's responding to. Like, she left because she wasn't familiar enough with land back and thought it should be left to people more knowledgeable to talk about. Yeah, she left because that wasn't her, she wasn't comfortable talking about that issue, which I had respect for. I don't know. I'm sure this interlocutor is fine, or this guest is fine, but insinuating right at the outset that Professor Flowers was being cynical and trying to make use of the ignorance of her audience, I think that's leaving a bad taste in my mouth. I'm pretty sure Dr. Heemdout was the one who baited that subject into convo. Yeah, I can't remember it thoroughly, but I was under the impression that a lot of that stuff got pulled in by Dr. Heemdout specifically. That whole conversation was drama bait, is my read on that.
But neither of them fully encapsulate the nuance of what it is to be an indigenous person repping the land back movement.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, that's a great base to start with.
Okay, but neither of these people were repping the land back movement. That's why she exited the conversation. So,
before we continue, though, I just have to ask. There's a bit of odd feedback coming from your microphone, almost like a...
Oh.
By the way, just to be clear, I'm not simping for Professor Flowers. I have a lot of criticisms for Professor Flowers' engagements in those interactions. She's not a dumb person by any stretch. Very intelligent person, but made a lot of very serious missteps in those interactions, and the Dr. Heemdout one in particular was a misstep just by having the interaction. Literally all Professor Flowers has to say on the matter of land back is to listen to indigenous people. Yeah, that's what I recall from it. Like, it seems that where Professor Flowers gets hammered is in reticence to make a positive statement concerning the limits of rights of sovereign peoples. And I go into this in my video addressed to Vaush. But that's of the essence of sovereignty, is that you can't put limits on it from without. Because if you do, then you're no longer talking about sovereignty. So you can say, for example, that something like displacing a population for the sake of revitalizing a culture that was diminished because of colonization. Like, it can have, like, you know, a very reasonable motive behind it. Even if something like that is really bad. Where was I going with this? Right, sorry. So if a group does something really bad, and it's bad regardless, because it involves displacing a bunch of people and, you know, breaking down communities that maybe they didn't have a right to be there over the previous occupants, but they still had their own intrinsic goods and whatnot. And you're traumatizing people, you're alienating them from a territory they've come to regard as their home, yada yada. At that point, what you do is, if a sovereign people choose to do that, if you care enough about it, you fight them. And then you force them in an honorable and honest way to do what you think is the ethical thing to do. What this moral grandstanding does, by saying that, no, they cannot be allowed to have the right to choose to do this, is effectively the same thing, but you're pretending that you're giving them sovereign right while actually you're relying on the real sovereignty of something else. Imposing boundaries on rights implies an overseeing body is present that is by definition not self-determination. Yeah, exactly. Again, this is not to say, and Professor Flowers, again, like, this has been severely understated in her interactions. When push comes to shove, she condemns people who want an ethno-state and people who want to displace groups. She characterizes it as messed up, as not a thing she likes, as bad, yada yada yada. She says at various points that she doesn't think it's right for interracial marriages to be discouraged, things like that. And there was something else. But yeah, like, oh, and yes, of course, and she condemns black nationalists and separatists who are anti-Semitic, homophobic, etc. Maybe not in as strong language as some people would like, but she condemns them nonetheless, and she throws those people under the bus. For the people who can be described by those terms, like, that may seem like such a trite thing for us, like, oh, like, wow, you condemn, outright neo-Nazis and whatnot. Great, that's such a bold position. For those people, that's a big deal. Yeah. Anyways.
A hollow noise. Maybe when you bump something.
Yeah.
There, it's being made right now.
Okay, I know what it is. I'm gonna try.
Like a thermos?
Yeah, it's got like a little. Here we go. Okay, let's do that. It's no, Scheiße.
What is that? Wait, I cannot tell
little,
what that is.
What is it called? It's like a spring. It's a little spring that keeps the tension on the different parts of it. So every time I move it, it goes. Bring, bring.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I would never have guessed that from the sound, but okay. Anyway, it wasn't a huge deal, so I didn't mean to put you out or anything. I just.
That's okay.
Right. Okay, so I guess I just want to open with my perspective on this, just because we all have our own biases. So, with regards to decolonization and land back, I talk mostly from an American perspective because that's what Americans always do, to others' detriment sometimes. But as I understand the land back movement here, it feels like, we had a great number of native tribes that the U.S. government lied to. We made contracts with them, and then we broke them, for the funsies of it. And the reservations we have now are like a shadow of a ghost of what their allotments were supposed to be. So when I think of land back, I think of fulfilling the legal obligations we set out as a baseline for addressing the inequality that centuries of colonization and genocide have entrenched. There are some things that I think are agreeable and some I don't. I do know there are people who make the argument, though I've never actually heard this from an indigenous person, that Native people have the right to take back over the United States, and that lefties should advocate for that, and that if you're white, you should go back to Europe. Now, I do not think that's representative of what most advocates for indigenous issues want, in part because it's very, very dumb, and I don't think that little of them. At least I think it's dumb, and also because it strikes me as sort of the logic of ethno-nationalism crammed into a more socially acceptable context. That's the stuff
I agree.
I tend to fight against, but I'm really amicable to other potential solutions. So when you think of land back in, I guess in Canada or wherever you think it's applicable, what do you think of?
So I'll use my perspective with my reservation actually being given a parcel of land back from the federal government as a thoroughway here. So land back to me, my parcel of land that was redistributed back to my band and my reservation is a huge area. It was enormous. And part of that area includes cities. It includes cities that have already been developed, that have already got infrastructure, that already have buildings and high schools and colleges and hospitals and yada 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 yada. And so there's no way for us to, move in and say, you guys all have to leave now because this is on technically our land. So that just isn't, first of all, it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense to waste the time and effort and manpower that it would take to try and articulate something like that. First of all, I don't think any reservation has the actual power to do that. And second of all, I don't think people want to. What we prefer is that in that parcel of land, there should be a pecking order for who gets access to the resources of that land first. So if that land now belongs to us legally, there should be no reason why anybody else gets to go onto that land and start chopping down trees, start building roads unless we say so. And if they do want to do that without our say so, then what they have to do is pay restitutions. So it's a double-sided issue. Part of the land back movement is getting access to land that hasn't been developed and taxing land that has been developed. If you're going to use resources from the land, if you're going to develop infrastructure on the land, and you're going to benefit from that, there's no reason why Indigenous people, 20, 30, 40 minutes away from those cities shouldn't be receiving some sort of taxation from those resources, from the money that's made in selling and buying those resources, from the income that's generated. There shouldn't be any reason why taxes can't be made for us to benefit from also, so that we can be equal on an equal platform.
Can I add to
And
that
Indigenous,
really quick?
yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say that in the U.S., I know that with regards to resource extraction, there are huge tracts of federal land out west, not so much east, but west, where we mine oil or we sell the rights to lumber, stuff like that. And I've heard that too, that there are areas where companies are given the right by the federal government to just essentially take what they want. And natives,
Absolutely.
right, they've said like, okay, this land was ours before, and it should be ours again. And the first thing we're doing is making you motherfuckers pay. You're going to pay us out the
That's
nose.
right. That's right.
For this.
If you want to take the land, if you really want it that bad, you're going to pay us out, and you're going to pay us out big time, and you're going to pay us out for as long as you're using it. Because there's no reason why anyone should be making millions of dollars, big money kahuna bucks, while kids on reservations are going hungry, while education is being funded 30% less, while clean water resources are being funded 30% less, and while the government is still taking land away from native reserves.
Okay, so what's sort of being pinpointed here, and it's not being made explicit, is that the land back movement is not identified with a bid for national self-determination on the order of the state. It's not competing with the state. The land that is treated to them, they are appealing for by right of an agreement, not by like that thing I learned recently. It was from the title of a fantasy novel, but was apparently on I think it was the French King's Canons, the Last Argument of Kings. I can't remember the actual French for it. But yeah, so the issue with the land back discussion, if memory serves from the Heimdall conversation, is that they were characterizing it as a bid for dominion over the state. But land back is literally just an attempt to pressure the government to honor agreed upon rights to land, for all intents and purposes, practically also still controlled by the state, because at the end of the day, they are allowing the use of that land by Indigenous peoples who still interface with the Canadian government. It's perverse, but it is what it is. Also, the Department of Interior is involved in mineral prospecting around the world and even in space. And the damage done to Indigenous people isn't at all limited to the U.S. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
If that is still happening, there's no good reason why we shouldn't be getting ours first, But to suggest
100%.
that that means we go into cities where people live already and have already, you know, like some people have been living in cities for generations. That doesn't make any sense to go into a developed city and say, all of you get out.
Okay, and to be clear as well, just because this wasn't clarified in the conversation with Vaush so far, between Morgan and Vaush, I mean, Professor Flowers didn't bring in the land back thing to the discussion. Dr. Heimdall did. And Professor Flowers didn't characterize land back as being something that was concerned with the displacement of white people, say, or of colonial peoples from let's say Canada. That was Dr. Heimdall's characterization. Professor Flowers' error in that conversation was not to push back on that very, very strongly. And I can't, again, like it's been a little while now, so I'm losing a bit of the content of that discussion. But my sense was that she just flat out was not sufficiently read up on that topic. And she acknowledged as much, and she vacated the conversation halfway as a result.
How is that? How does that make sense? It just doesn't make sense to me.
There's
And I see there's so many people that will use that. They'll use the land back movement to be like, well, they should be allowed to say if they want to do it. And I'm like, yeah, sure, maybe technically, but can you not see the harm and the detriment in suggesting that Indigenous people should be allowed to do a genocide? Like,
there's a term for that, right? So this is like a racist.
Okay, so the United States is allowed to do a genocide. That's just a fact. Why? Because if the United States does a genocide, nobody else can stop them. So again, when we're talking about sovereign power, we're not talking about good and evil, we're talking about what you can do. And if you are the entity in a territory that can do whatever you want, if you can determine the destiny of that territory for yourself without any outside pressure, except whatever, for whatever reason, you impose upon yourself because you care about these outcomes, then you are the sovereign, and you indeed can do whatever you want, including very, very, very bad things that should be fought against tooth and nail, like genocide. To say that Indigenous people cannot do this is to say one of two things. Either you are saying they morally cannot do this, which is not to say that they practically can't do it, it's to say that they shouldn't do it, or it's to say that they are in fact not sovereign. Because if they are practically unable to do this, if they do not have the right to do this, which again does not mean, like when we're talking about the right here, like Vaush is an atheist, I believe. Like we're not talking about some cosmic, I think he's also a moral anti-realist, as I am. We're not talking about like some cosmic measure that condemns some actions and validates others. At that level, we are actually just talking about what can establish an ambience in which right can have any meaning. Like we're almost talking about right in a purely negative sense. There's nothing to say you don't have the right. This is like, you know, at the level of sovereigns, we are basically in a Hobbesian state of nature. So, now as far as the harm of locuting that, yeah, that's probably not a smart idea to be talking about that in a discussion where you're trying to portray national, or shall we say, like Indigenous sovereignty as a purely positive thing, because of course, like you're pinpointing the fact that, well, actually, real sovereignty opens the door to all sorts of things, good and bad. Unfortunately, mostly bad, because the range of bad things we can do vastly outnumbers the range of good things we can do, at least like at the outset, right? Especially when you're talking about sort of like terraforming a previously occupied state to be hospitable to a new one. The guest's word sounds like she gets it. She said, yeah, technically allowed, but bad. Okay, I'm dead tired, so I may have missed that.
A conspiracy theory, kind of the fear of retribution, and
Yeah.
it has a million like invocations, but generally it's the idea that like if we gave power to this minority group. So step one is denying the idea that the minority was ever mistreated. Step two is when it looks like they might get equal rights, you say, okay, we totally mistreated them. And also, they're going to do it to us just as bad.
Yeah.
They're going to do it to us worse if they get the power too. So we can't let them have that power. And I feel like, so obviously a lot of very racist groups have said that. I disagree with that. But sometimes I get the feeling there are people online who will invoke the fear of retribution as a positive. Like, yes. They will do this, and you should be thankful that you get to participate in their retribution. Like, oh, wow, okay.
Well, no, hang on. When we're talking about relationships between peoples and we're identifying indigenous groups as being a separate people from the state, as potentially even bearing sovereignty, then we're not talking about the moral standing of individuals. We're talking about the moral standing of those groups. And if indeed it is the case, and it is the case, that the Canadian state or the American state or whatever performed genocidal actions upon the indigenous groups, and the indigenous groups have no desire for retribution and only want to live well, which is, by the way, is very, very Rousseauian understanding of the state of nature, then it actually does kind of make sense. It's like, wow, good thing that they have their priorities in that order, or good thing that they have such a distaste for cruelty or something like that. That's not telling white people to kowtow to indigenous people. That's just saying, like, look, our state from which we benefit, that operates on land that is still stolen, because it doesn't stop being stolen just because a few hundred years have passed. They have no inclination, should they ever get the power, to do harm to us in return. So, cool. Like, that's not this for some reason is being read as a threat, and no doubt there are people who do that, but those people aren't really serious, and I don't think Professor Flowers was doing that.
I think it's coming from just a similar place of ignorance, actually, and not in a cruel kind of way. I think it's just honestly that people are so uninformed about how Indigenous people think about land, about the land back movement. I think that, you know, especially on the rad left side, you'll find people who will say, like, you know, a lot of crazy stuff like that, and you say, okay, that's great and all, but, like, do you know what you're talking about? You know, do you really know what you're talking about? You know, going onto Twitter and, like, asking 3 or 4 people if they should or should not be allowed to do something is not the way to turn this conversation. The way to turn this conversation is, like you're doing here,
Okay, but who asked that? Did Professor Flowers ask that, or did Vaush and Dr. Heemdout ask that? Because I don't think Professor Flowers actually asked that. I don't think Professor Flowers ever asked if indigenous people should be allowed to genocide or displace immigrant populations. Or colonizing populations, or whatever term you like. I'm pretty sure what happened was there was a comparison made to white nationalists or something. That was objected to, and then it was asked, so do you think that, indigenous or colonized or previously enslaved communities have the right to displace groups of people in order to create spaces away from their oppressors, right? That's how that came in. It was completely underdetermined on Professor Flowers' part, and that was a mistake. I don't think that should have been argued in that context without a moderator, certainly without preparation, like massive preparation. But that wasn't Flowers who said that. So she, by implication, and a whole bunch of other people are effectively being blamed for what, frankly, Vaush and Heemdout did. I think I'm remembering this correctly. Somebody please correct me.
including Indigenous voices in the rhetoric and allowing us the opportunity to. It's not that people are getting it so wrong, it's just we need to smooth some wrinkles out so that people don't start using really inflammatory language to describe how we feel about our own problems.
Yeah, in a way, it reminds me a lot of. I know these aren't perfectly like parallel, but back during the Black Lives Matter protests here in the U.S., when they were at their peak, at least, there was this weird disconnect where the movement is ostensibly about the interests and the rights of black people and their treatment by the police and other issues, but there were people on the far left who were saying like, yeah, that's step one, but we also need socialism. And they would try to put that into the movements. And look, I'm a socialist. I agree with the message, but it felt
Right.
like it was being used as a vehicle for sometimes for other issues, which seems to me to be like essentially the opposite of what's repeated almost like dogma on the left, which is listen to the oppressed. Sometimes it feels like by
True.
listen to the oppressed, they mean listen to the oppressed people who agree with us and ignore the ones who don't. And I know,
Yeah.
yeah, and I've seen that like I know I've seen that in like sometimes with the like the black community, like sometimes black people who have more moderate voices will get shouted down by the more radical ones. And while I like the
Yes. Yeah.
discourse, I don't like the constant almost like oppression Olympics where it's like,
it it's
yeah,
hard to come into a scenario where, you know,
Okay, so without like examples, it's difficult to actually pinpoint. Well, okay. Here's what I'm thinking as they're saying this. They're complaining of more radical voices, sort of batting down more moderate voices. And what I read from that is people who want major actions taken place to remedy ongoing problems, maybe even definitive and irrevocable actions to take place, are reacting to people who are suggesting things that sort of definitionally preclude that possibility by saying, no, let's leave things as they are and make incremental changes to make them better. And maybe in practice, one is more viable than another one simply because it would take an enormous amount of manpower and organization and willpower and consensus that simply isn't there to do the radical thing. But at the same time, that lack of those things is also partially due to the proliferation of people of that sort of quote unquote more moderate stripe. And crucially, they aren't more moderate. I really hate this language of moderate and radical because it's a distinction without a difference. Typically, what it actually refers to is somebody is radically in favor of something that is already in power and therefore relatively tranquil, and somebody else, the radical one, is in favor of upsetting that in a serious way. But in cosmic terms, they're doing the same thing. Just one is in favor of a state of affairs that is not in existence, and one is in favor of a state of affairs that is very much in existence and is in no danger of going anywhere anytime soon.
when you're on the left side, you're already dealing with the right. You know, you're already dealing with people who just, first of all, they hate you. They don't want to give you the time of day to begin with. And to have then to also be incorporating infighting in your rhetoric, you know, having to manage that because some people on the left think that you'll never be left enough is really frustrating. And I hate it. I
I
hate it so much.
I imagine that must be incredibly frustrating. I want to know, by the way, in case I can find a map, you described a big land back gain that was received
Yes.
recently. Is there a name associated with it that I could look up?
So I don't know if I can't remember what it's called, but my reservation or my band, it will you'll probably be able to find it better that way, is Whitefish River First Nation. So they encapsulate a few different reserves, including mine, and mine is I think one of the anchor style reserves.
Gotcha. That's a pretty logo. I when I was in university in Northern California, I'm ashamed to admit that I don't remember details, including the names, but there were a few really prominent indigenous groups in that area because Washington does
Oh, yeah.
have, there's there's a good bit of land there. committed to that. And sometimes they would come to the university, or I would talk with them, and I felt like their arguments were always really, really good. Like, I don't think I ever
Yes.
heard a bad one, but I never see
Yeah.
those arguments thrown out in the public. It's always like the most milquetoast moderate bullshit, or it's
Yeah.
such absurdly hyperbolic, like radical dogma that it's alienating to anyone outside
Yes.
of that like ideological block.
I think the reason why that happens is because, at least in my experience, whenever I'm talking about Indigenous issues with other Indigenous people, I notice that other Indigenous people tend to have this sort of spiritual rhetoric that works hand in hand with their actual talking points.
Hmm.
And so when you're not from that background, like if you're white especially, and you start to see native people talking about the creator and talking about this stuff and that stuff, while they're also trying to teach you about movements like the land back movement, we especially lose the younger crowd. And so there's a lot of self-censorship that goes on to make ourselves more approachable and appealable to mainstream talking points.
Yeah, no,
It doesn't always happen, but it sometimes you can tell right away.
Well, I've
that it's
seen that,
happening.
right? Wasn't that kind of? I remember that being a big thing in the '70s, at least here in the United States. I wasn't
Yeah.
around back then, but I've heard it was like there was a wave of liberal sympathy for the plight of the Native American, but it was framed in this very weird, almost like noble savage.
That's
They
correct.
they were
Yeah.
closer to the land. Talking about like the native genocide, the same way you might talk about like a deforestation or a species of fish going extinct, where it's like the beauty of
Yes.
nature has been soiled. It's like, this you might disagree with me on this, but from what I've read on the many, many native tribes here in the United States, I feel like a lot of the narrative of them being more in touch with nature and blah blah blah, I feel like a lot of that, from what I've read, is horseshit. That they
It
would
depends.
there were elements of it. Certainly, I mean, obviously the Europeans came over with a much more antagonistic attitude towards land ownership and stuff like that, but they're mythologized to these like near like deific, like almost like you guys are like dryads or like satyrs or so, where you're like,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's like, well, I've seen like these Twitter takes that you wouldn't believe, like before Europeans, like there was no rape in the Americas. Like, what are you talking about? Like, they never
Yeah.
did war. What are you talking
No,
about? They're
there was
people.
we literally have songs and dances and drumming circles for warriors. One of the biggest things in Ojibwe culture is at the opening of every, I don't know if every powwow, but on the powwow on my reserve, we open with the song Ogichitakwe, which is the warrior woman. It's the warrior woman song. And in Ojibwe culture, we honor our women specifically. Like we're big on treating women and men as equals, and so we honor our women at the powwows by introducing them through song first. But it's warrior woman, and we have this concept about like war is a pretty big like thing culturally for Indigenous communities. Like, I don't know why anyone would think that we didn't have war. And also, a lot of the core foundations in the way that America's legal system is set up is based off of Indigenous tribes managing war, and how they managed each other's different parties, and how people would be allowed to, if you were from this warring state and that warring clan, you would come together in one house and you would both be allowed a time to speak, and you would both be allowed an audience to air out your grievances. And that became one of the foundations of American law. And that happened because there was war. Like, it didn't happen because everybody liked each other all the time.
I think the big failing of that liberal sympathy that I was talking about was that it put a lot of Native people, I think, in a
It
museum.
infantilizes us.
Right, you're a
It
Disney.
infantilizes us.
Yeah, you're like a Disney trope.
Yeah.
It is, well, because people, real living, breathing people, are, in addition to being generally shitty at times, I think, political problems that have to be dealt with immediately. All people, any
Yeah.
group, any ethnicity. But, mystical forest wisdom people. Well, that's more of an abstract concept that isn't necessarily directly derivative of Native Americans. So you could go, you can
Yeah,
know, it doesn't
it
really have to
it can
involve
be.
policy.
The issue, I think, the issue is that it can be like
By the way, just because this really bugs me, when, for example, you hear about the noble savage in Rousseau, Rousseau, first of all, doesn't actually talk about the noble savage in that way. The noble savage is someone who is in such a is so unentangled with other human beings, is so like prior to society, that there is no state of war because there is no firm property and people only have relations with each other like animals, so long as they absolutely require their presence as they're growing up or while they're mating or whatever. The native tribes of Canada, or of North America generally, are not savages. These are civilized people. They have societies, they have communities, they have technologies, they have arts. These are people who have been corrupted by, the development of reason in the arts and things like that, on a Rousseauian view. And furthermore, the uh, the innocence of a pre-societal person in Rousseau isn't such that, oh, these were just like human beings as God intended. They were just like perfectly perfectly physically fit. They were perfectly physically fit and perfectly virtuous and just like brave, selfless people. No, no, they were perfectly fit because all they did was stuff that conduced to their fitness, and they couldn't rely on any technology whatsoever to ease any of their tasks. And they were peaceable not because they were well disposed, but because they had a poverty of reasons to not be peaceable. The problem with Hobbes, and this is what Rousseau corrects in Hobbes, is that Hobbes projects a state of war that is only possible given a population that assumes the existence of things like property and assumes the existence of things like amour propre. So the idea that you value yourself by reference to what other people think of you. You care about reputation, things like that. You feel as if you have a thing that can be harmed by an offense besides just your body. So that when somebody hurts you, you don't just think to get out of danger, you think of, revenging yourself on that person. Whereas, like, there's that video on YouTube of, like, the two koalas, they're climbing a tree, and one just yanks the other one out because he wants the tree for himself. The koala just falls to the ground and starts crying for a bit. Does he go back and try to get revenge? No. I mean, he does actually try to go and force the other koala out, but eventually he just, he just whines and then goes on with his life. He doesn't hold, like, a grudge. He doesn't go to war with the koala, the other koala. That's the noble. I don't actually know if Rousseau even uses the term. I don't think he used the term noble savage. That's just sort of been attributed to him. I could be wrong on that, but that's my sense. So that's what that's about. When you see like the Pocahontas thing, where natives just had like a magical relationship to the land, like their religion, of course, involved the territory in which they lived, as was the case for everybody. But like given modern technology, given acclamation to a world in which involvement in capitalism is requisite for political power and stability and wealth, they'd act like everybody else does. Obviously.
especially amongst our elders, the way my elders speak, I don't know that they would be happy to have a political discussion like this, because it's just not conducive to their way of speech and their way of understanding it and their experience and perception of the world. And part of that perception is that very classically hokey pokey spirits and all this kind of stuff, rhetoric. Like, it does come up. and you see it less in young people because, you know, we're going to scare you off if we do that. You're going to look at us like we're, first of all, like we're, you know, a museum exhibit, because it's so difficult for modern society to take, you know, spiritual dogmatism seriously, which is fair. I think I think that's reasonable for young people to, as well, any person rather, to feel that way. But if our culture and our rights to land and our rights to our heritage are so closely intertwined with the way we perceive the world, I think, you know, why is it so hard for everybody to kind of be okay with that? You don't do anything like that to black people. You don't take, you know, black culture and say like, oh, yeah, you know, yeah, we got to help, you know, black people. But if only they'd stop with the hokey pokey weirdness, and only if they'd stop listening to like rap music. Like, no, you don't say that.
A lot of people do, though. Just saying. A lot of people do. And I don't know, like voodoo has been parodied to the point that it's taken as a joke. That's one example.
Accept that black culture is what is defined by black people. And the same needs to happen, I think, for indigenous people in order for them to start getting comfortable enough to really opining on it.
So, okay, I think that's really interesting because I've gotten a little bit in trouble over this before, and I guess I want your opinion on it. So, I would be one of those younger people who's very off-put by spirituality. I find those arguments unconvincing, and I think that if you start to factor in perspectives like that, then you start to talk about, like, okay, well,
Here's something I don't like. So when we're talking about, like, and I've been using this language too, so I'm guilty of this, but when we're talking about, like, indigenous religion or indigenous spirituality, what are we actually talking about? Like, the word spirit the word spirit and spirituality and even religion, these have, like, cultural baggage, right? They refer to specific things. Like, spiritus originally was air, like it was breath. You expire, right? And you also, like, expire. If you're characterizing indigenous beliefs or indigenous practice or whatever you want to call it in these terms, you appear very strongly to actually not be describing indigenous culture at all. What you're doing is you're imagining Roman religion, say, warped to fit the social form, or what appears to be the social form in a superficial analysis of these indigenous groups. Like, we're not... And so, like, when Vaush is saying, like, I'm really uncomfortable with spiritual talk, it's like, okay. But is that spiritual talk really? Or is that just being misconstrued as quote-unquote spiritual talk? It's something else. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you necessarily would be comfortable with it. I'm not comfortable with it, but that's a different question.
do the Israelis have a moral right to their territory because of their thousands of years old, you know, story on this, that, or the other? And like it circles back to a lot of stuff. And I know that there are arguments for land back, which have to do with like the inherent tie to the land that some native groups have.
That's
like
correct,
spiritually.
yeah.
Now, I'll admit, I've never cared about any of these arguments. I do care about restitution, equality, you know, writing of...
Okay, so here, this is actually really important. So, the idea of law. Obviously, the word law comes from Latin lex, but that was used to translate Greek nomos. What did nomos refer to? Nomos referred to divisions of land. Because at the end of the day, sovereignty and political identity and political self-determination has to do with your relationship to a section of land. On this section of land, I have the right to do whatever I like and to dispose of it however I like. That is sovereignty. If indigenous people seek sovereignty, or if they seek sovereignty over territories they were once able to occupy without being sovereigns and to make full use of by right, that inevitably entails a specific relationship to land. And if they're arguing on the grounds that it's essential to their culture that these particular areas of land are maintained and held by the tribe and honored in a certain way, then to deny that is to deny sovereignty, categorically. I think what's being missed out here is that, like, yeah, obviously, like when you're trying to translate this out to an audience and you're trying to make it receptive, yeah, there are practical moves you should make. But at the same time, that doesn't actually make a difference at the level of making the assertion of sovereign right, or making a bid for sovereign right, rather, because it actually doesn't matter how silly it seems to somebody else. It's you're in charge, right? Land back, for all I know, it's a pipe dream, but my great aspiration is for the enclosures in Britain to be reversed. Land back just refers to treated land being, treaties with indigenous people, between indigenous people in North America and the Crown, or the American state. It's the idea that these should be honored. That's all. Like, there's no actual bid for anything new there. That land has already been treated. Often, like, treaties were often coerced, but that land has been treated. So it's literally just saying, hey, respect these agreements you made. It's nothing really that radical at all. Oh, we don't want heat, we want cool. There we go.
Of injustices, stuff like that. But for me, I've always been a little concerned that, and this could just be my biases, but that the advocacy for it along spiritual lines almost undercuts the real political project, because I think you can make a very, very strong secular argument for the land back that you advocated before. Not because, like, your spiritual tie to the land, but because it was your fucking land. I mean, you don't have to spiritually justify, like, theft as a concept. You can
That's
just...
right. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Okay, but, like, what if that doesn't work? What if people just don't care? Because a lot of people don't care. So, and sometimes, like, the target isn't other people. Sometimes the target is saying to indigenous kids, like, hey, why should you care? Because there are a ton of enticements to devote your life to indigenous resurgence, especially if you're able to be successful on your own esteem, for whatever reason. There we go. Sorry, it got really hot in here, so I turned my air conditioner on, so that noise might have been annoying. Can you argue it on secular grounds? Like, yeah, obviously. Are there audiences where that's more effective? Sure, but, like, there are uses to this other kind of argumentation.
Yeah. So most people, I've noticed too, you know, we're very happy to articulate the land back movement without involving.
Furthermore, many of our political institutions, including the concept of citizenship, are themselves evolutions of religious institutions. If you are trying to revitalize a culture that is not continuous with European culture, at least not until a certain point, and you want its own categories and its own forms to be asserted, then asserting those traditional things, even if you don't believe in them, is actually vitally important. Because it's either that, or you're simply reifying colonial institutions, and that's not the goal. Does that make sense?
The spiritual aspect of it, because it can be separated. But you'll notice that indigenous people will have a lot more to say if they are given the opportunity to include some of those spiritual aspects. And it's the same as, like, if I'm not saying it's right, but it's the same as, you know, if you went into town and you burned down the church, right? That would make Christian people unhappy. And in the same way, when indigenous people see the government stealing ceremonial grounds for fasting, for instance, like we have a fasting ground on my reservation, and if it came about, you know, tomorrow that some company was going to bust in there and you know, tear it apart, of course the right to keep the land because it's our land.
I've mentioned this before, but my job actually takes me on top of the blasted ruins of an indigenous burial site. It wasn't regarded as defended by law as a religious heritage site because it had no building standing on it. Like there's a clear cut example of institutional racism, by the way, where only European style structures or style sacred spaces get the protection of law.
Takes hold above anything else. But personally, knowing that they were attacking a spiritual monument to us is like extra salt in the wound. And I think it's I think it's hard for non-indigenous people to engage in this conversation because we're so closely tied to our culture, knowing that it was that so much of it was eradicated, and that we're scrambling so hard to just keep hold of what we can at this point, and doing a really great job of it and fighting the good fight. But that's a really hard sell to the secular world. It's a really hard sell to go to young people and say, like, yeah, you should do what indigenous people tell you to do because they're on the red path. They're walking the path. They're doing the healing. They're doing the ceremonies and stuff like that. It's not an easy thing to do, but the reason it's also important is because our culture and our cultural practices are one of the few things in society that works conducively with indigenous people to help them heal from intergenerational trauma. And being attached to those rhetorics and those teachings and those historical sites and those spiritual attitudes is helping our people more than any other service in Canada is.
Okay. I think that 2 points. I think that makes a lot of sense, Even if you were to speak of it explicitly in secular terms, when you're talking about restitution in like a court case for damages, sentimental value is one of those factors, right? I mean, even if you're talking about nothing religious or inherently culturally valuable, you could be talking about the value of like a piece of property that belonged to your great this, that, or the other. Stuff like that is factored in even in secular cases. So it seems logical then that even if I don't buy the spiritual argument, the spiritual importance of the land or of other tangential stuff,
Yeah.
you can recognize that no matter what. Like, because, like, for instance, if there was a court case and somebody had an heirloom from the 1700s, like, and they got really mad that it was lost or destroyed or stolen, I don't have to I don't have to get why they cared about it to recognize that there's some special importance there that can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You don't have to understand it. You just have to respect it. If you don't have to believe in, the spiritual rhetoric and dogmatism that surrounds indigenous cultures. But for Pete's sake, would it kill you to just be a little polite, if we want to talk about it?
I actually
I,
saw online, there was once, I don't know if it was real or not, but a story of a parent saying that to punish their kid, they deleted a Minecraft world that their kid had
oh
worked
my
on for a long
gosh.
time. Now,
I would kill my mom.
in an objective sense, that Minecraft world is literally worthless. But the internet went to an uproar, and clearly you understand why. So,
Yeah.
like, yeah. So if we can agree that the subjective value of a Minecraft world is worthy of an internet backlash, then I guess you can probably make a pretty strong argument for, I don't know, thousands and thousands of years of cultural heritage tied to the landmarks of the region that you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it does play an interesting debate too, when you're talking as if you want to, bring what's happening with Israel and Palestine into it can be a slippery slope, right? It doesn't take much for things to get absolutely haywire right out of the bat. And I think that's one of the other reasons why the general public doesn't want to get too into talking about Native issues, because first of all, in North America, if you come here and you're here as a settler or even as an immigrant, there's this understanding that, you might own your house, you might rent an apartment, you might own your car, but you don't own the land. The land doesn't belong to you. And when we think about it in terms of from that perspective of being a settler or an immigrant, the federal government owns the land and uses it to put houses on top of it, and you can own the house. That's kind of the rhetoric. And so it's very, very difficult to try and opine on subjects about land when the opposing party doesn't have the same history with land that you do. Like I used to struggle as a teenager trying to articulate to adults why we should keep our land. I have people say to me, like, well, why don't you just move? Why don't you give it up? Why do you have to have the land? And it's because that land is tied to every aspect of our person in a way that settlers and immigrants don't have the capacity to do so because they don't own land. It would be the same as if you went to somebody's house that was there for generations and generations and you kicked the people in there out of it and said, this is our house now. And imagine how the degree of displacement that would cause, and I think people don't realize it's still happening. Even though our reservation received a huge parcel of land back, which is really fabulous, it wasn't more than 10 years ago that people were still stealing chunks of it away.
I don't like characterizing colonial groups as lacking this connection to this sort of like emotional connection to land simply because um, the federal government technically owns it. Because if that is indeed the case, whence all this fear mongering about land back, right? It's sort of baked into that. And like even in the aimed out discussion, like when he was talking about like I immigrated here, I regard this place as my home. Like why can't I? Like he has that same sentimental attachment to the territory. I think crucially though, I think I don't want to speak for it, but I get the sense that there's something else going on there that people don't tend to locute very much, and that is, it's sort of like, I think it was Chesterton who had this idea of the democracy of the dead, where you don't just perform political actions or like maintain institutions for the sake of the well-being of people now living. You also do it to honor the endeavors of everybody who came before. And I think a part of what gives indigenous groups a peculiar, at least in a very strong normative sense, a right to these treaty territories is that these were of tremendous value to people who were rightfully there prior, and it seems to be doing them a tremendous dishonor to be abusing the territories in that way. I can't speak for it. That's just my speculation, but I get the sense there's a lot of that going on. And that, too, is a large part of the impetus for a lot of these religious displays that a lot of people don't necessarily believe in, and they adhere to them nonetheless for reasons extrinsic to whether or not they believe in whatever things are being referenced by stories or songs or dances or imagery. Like, I mean, it's not a flattering comparison, but like for example, Greek fascists using what was that symbol they used in that rally a little while ago? Was it like a Lacedaemonian symbol or something? I can't remember.
We're still parceling it off into golf courses and making backdoor deals with municipalities to get reelected as chiefs or whatever, and using land as a bribe for that. Like that still happens. So I don't get the rhetoric where people, I don't know. I guess that's a different issue, but
well, it's all related, right? And I mean, I get that. And honestly, I think a lot of people, including myself, I'm always going to be averse to the spiritualism, but cultural sentimentality, I understand. I mean, imagine like Stonehenge for the English, or Taj Mahal, or if you just want to talk about like just purely the land, the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon.
Oh my gosh, right?
This it's like Americana.
That's a good one though, because that's actually let's get into that, because that's actually a really interesting topic. Let's talk about Mount Rushmore.
Oh,
so
yeah,
I've heard
a controversy about that one.
So Mount Rushmore was originally of not a maybe not a well, I'm sure it was a spiritual location at one point, but it was called something else. I think it was called the something grandfathers. Anyway, we believe that mountains are quote unquote grandfathers, like metaphorically. So those are like those are the oldest spirits that ever spirited, right? And so they're like very significant to us. Each mountain is very important. We put a lot of importance on types of mountains, and then settlers came and carved a bunch of faces into them and then called those mountains theirs, and completely erased any cultural history and significance that was had by indigenous people for that location. And now there's a push, so I've heard, that people...
The Golden Dawn? I don't know if it was the Golden Dawn. I know what the Golden Dawn is. They've got like the weird swastika thing. I thought I was thinking of somebody else. I could be dreaming, but...
want to reclaim...
Or a better example would be like the, rad treads with their Deus Vault nonsense.
Mount Rushmore under the reservation, the band that previously it was associated to. And I think that's a really interesting question, because that falls into the line of, like, if indigenous people don't have the right to do a genocide, do we have a right to dismantle symbols of colonialism, even if they're long-standing beloved symbols?
I
it's
am
like...
totally on board with you ethically, but pragmatically, I think the American people would sooner vote to tactically nuclear strike every reservation in our border.
Hang on a sec. Wait a minute. Okay, so I'm going to go back like a couple of minutes. I just want to...
Oh, yeah, I've heard
Rushmore,
a controversy about that one.
Okay, Mount
right?
Rushmore.
So Mount Rushmore was originally I'm sure it was a spiritual location at one point, but it was called something else. I think it was called the something grandfathers. Anyway, we believe that mountains are quote unquote grandfathers, like metaphorically. So those are like those are the oldest spirits that ever spirited, right? And so they're like very significant to us. Each mountain is very important. We put a lot of importance on types of mountains, and then settlers came and carved a bunch of faces into them and then called those mountains theirs, and completely erased any cultural history and significance that was had by indigenous people for that location. And now there's a push, so I've heard, that people want to reclaim Mount Rushmore under the reservation, the band that previously it was associated to. And I think that's a really interesting question, because that falls into the line of, like, if indigenous people don't have the right to do a genocide, do we have a right to dismantle symbols of colonialism, even if they're long-standing beloved symbols?
No, they don't. And it's not a normative claim. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that they do that. But insofar as, again, you're appealing to the better nature of another power to allow you to do a thing, then definitionally you don't have the right. The state has the right, and they can grant it to you. And that's really where this whole thing falls apart. Because again, if we're talking about self-determination is absolute. It is self-determination, not self-determination within the bounds set by Big Brother. It's self-determination, sovereignty.
I am totally on board with you ethically.
No, you're not. You're not on board with her ethically, because you were against Professor Flowers making the same point.
But pragmatically, I think the American people would sooner vote to tactically nuclear strike every reservation in our borders than they would be willing to give up the Mount Rushmore. Look, if nothing else, it's you can use it as like a condemnation of our creativity, because you referred to the mountains as grandfathers on their own, but we had to literally carve faces onto them like children to refer to them as our founding fathers. We had to. We're too literal. We had to the metaphor didn't work with us. Okay, we had to actually.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Burned water. The Golden Dawn used a meandrus, which is a decorative border motif in ancient Greek constructions. But if you look at the color scheme, it's obvious they were going for a swastika resemblance.
Sit down there and physically carve them in.
Yeah.
Who has the sovereignty to blow up Mount Rushmore? The state does. Now, who has the ability to blow up Mount Rushmore? Anyone who can. But if we're talking about the right, that's something else.
Yeah.
I'm totally on board with the spirit and sentiment, though. I've always found, I swear to God, I'm not doing.
It's weird. Vaush, an anarchist, hinges on the okay of his state. Vaush is a liberal, and I'm not dissing him for this, but he needs to come to terms with the fact that he's not an anarchist. He is a liberal. He is a progressive, reformist liberal. And there's a lot of good things you can do as a progressive, reformist liberal, but he is a liberal through and through. He does not have a stomach for actual, like, really radical politics.
Doing this to virtue signal. I think Mount Rushmore is really ugly. I have never cared about Mount Rushmore. It's not even that I hate the founding fathers or whatever. I mean, maybe I do, but for different reasons. I just think that I just think it's ugly. I just do not get the appeal. I don't know.
I do feel it's a little tacky.
It's tacky. It's tacky.
It's a little tacky, right? Like I get that, like, Egypt has the pyramids and India has the Taj Mahal, and, like, everybody's got their thing, and I guess America was, like, really excited about, you know, colonizing the whole of North America and really wanted to swing their dicks around. But, you know, come on, you know, giant faces of old people.
I'm not saying this would have been any better for indigenous people. I'm just saying, like, if you want to celebrate the ancestry of our country or heritage or whatever, for however far back that goes, like, employ some metaphor. What if they had carved the entire face of the mountain so that one half of it was rocky and craggy like normal, and the other half was just a perfectly smooth facade upon which, like, the outline of the American borders were traced? Or something. I don't know.
Do you mean like in Fooly Cooly, how there's those giant irons that are always looming in the background, ready to iron
Don't
over
bring
the
Fooly
world?
Cooly up with me, okay? We already like you enough. You don't need to lean it in, okay?
I'm pretty sure Vaush is only uncomfortable with violent revolution because he doesn't see it as being successful. Okay, but the question isn't whether or not he sees violent revolution as being successful or as being... the question is not whether he's pessimistic with respect to violent revolution. The question is, what are the terms of success? And if the terms of success are the reification of the state, albeit a more humanitarian one and a more equal one, then you're still operating within the paradigm of the paradigm of the liberal state. And so you're not actually that radical. You're a liberal. Maybe you're radical as far as liberals go, but you're a liberal through and through. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. There's a lot of merits to liberalism, but you know, like, he's not an anarchist. Not at all. He is a thoroughbred archist.
You've already won the crowd. You don't need to bring it home like that. But yes, honestly, if they had just carved it into a gigantic ironing thing and been like, "Hey guys, in 100 years this anime will come out, and listen, okay, it's gonna be sick as shit."
Could you imagine? My mind would be exploding. It'd be amazing.
It in all seriousness, I do totally get the cultural argument for all that, you know. We're talking about, like, landmarks and all that, and I think, I don't know, because, like, when we talk about, like, the attachment certain tribes have to the land, and I'm just kind of guessing here, but I'm guessing it's like, for 1,000 years, the waterfall has been over there, and there are just, like, traditions associated with that waterfall, and that right there is the mountain face, and you can tell that the thing happens when the sun goes up. It's like traditions associated with the particular geography.
Yeah, so I'll get into that because I actually have personal experience with that. So this will sound a little extreme, but I'm very happy about this, and I hope to do it again sometime. But on my reservation, in my culture, you reach a certain age, you go on your vision quest, right? And for me, I was 11 years old. I went on top of our fasting mountain called Dreamer's Rock, which is a beautiful place. And you sit on the top of the mountain and you don't eat anything for as long as you can. You drink some water and maybe you get to have a crazy vision and then you go home. And I don't necessarily believe...
Is it
in this...
water or is it water, by the way? Just curious.
Oh, no, it's just plain water.
If that's the case, isn't basically everybody but the most far left leftists liberal? I mean, there are some crazy far leftists who are very liberal too. What liberal in this context means isn't that you have, like, a certain set of like moderate values and, like, codes of politeness and decency and civility and things like that. What it has to do ultimately is with your orientation around... You're a liberal if your orientation is around liberal political categories, if that's how you conceive the world. It's a paradigm of thought. Now, within liberalism, we conceive of different political ideologies as being different configurations of these categories. But an actual radical is somebody who challenges those categories themselves, which is why, again, like really radical people like Marx and people after him are even reticent to describe what a capitalistic society would even look like, because they're afraid of basically just reifying those categories again. It has to be something radically different. So yeah, most people are liberal, because most people buy into the liberal paradigm. Like the modern state form is really the liberal state. The modern state can refer to a ton of different things. It can refer to pre-liberal states, but the liberal state is more or less what we have, or what we had until relatively recently. It's questionable whether we still have it in fact.
Okay.
Plain water.
Okay. Just
The
curious.
only other thing that you're allowed to have is your medicines, your smudging medicines, which
Does the definition of radical change with context of the time? I mean, the definition of radical will depend on how the person is using the term radical, but how I think the term radical, and how I think a lot of people who use the term radical seriously think it is indeed radical. You have a thing here, and your orientation to that thing here is away, right? Radical. If it's not away, if you're a good obedient blood cell and you're contributing even by your little acts of spite and rebellion against the status quo to the functioning of this thing, and you aren't even oriented towards destroying it or dismantling it or what have you, then you're a part of it. You're of that domain. Why is it questionable if we still have the liberal state? That's a big discussion. I'm not even going to touch that right now while I'm this tired, but that would be something worth talking about in the near future.
I don't know if I'm allowed to talk on that too much because I'm not
Read Carl Schmitt's The Concept of the Political for a good, introduction to that line of thinking.
a medicine person, so you have to get information about that stuff more directly from them. But suffice it to say that I did the whole kit and caboodle and yada yada yada, and I don't necessarily agree with the entire spiritual aspect of it. Like, I really don't believe that if I go up onto a mountain and like starve myself that I'm going to receive like a literal message from God. But what that did for me was it solidified my experience as an Indigenous person, and it also solidified my relationship to my grandmother who took me on this journey, and it solidified my relationship to my land, to my reservation. So I have an unbreakable bond now with myself as an Indigenous person, with my family as an Indigenous person, and with my land as an Indigenous person. And that's not something that can be bought. That's something that it's infallible. I when I go through life, especially because I'm half white, I'm gonna get a lot of. That's.
So I'm joking. I'm sorry. It's just I guess.
But so I'm gonna go through a lot of times with Indigenous people, knowing that I have to step aside, knowing that I have to.
Doesn't all one need to be liberal is to be fundamentally anti-capitalist? Well, not exactly, because liberalism arguably predates capitalism by a little bit. However, capitalism is inherently liberal in many respects. It's not like metaphysically tied to liberalism, but it presumes a lot of different things that are innovations of liberalism. The idea of an untouchable private realm, for example, things like that. The sort of Christian inherited idea of the autonomy of consciousness, which gives rise to the idea of an atomistic human being that gives rise to the state by, individual interest, individual mutual self-interest. Random, it bothers me when Vaush and Destiny and such kick around in games while holding these sorts of discussions. I can't do that, but they seem to be able to do so and focus on the conversation. Like, I've tried playing games while having conversations, and I just lose myself. But I get, like, really into it.
Humble myself or lower myself or stifle my voice a little bit because I don't have the full encapsulation of the indigenous perspective at my at my usage, but my cultural practice of my vision quest has solidified that for me in a way that can't be deterred and is not something that I can cheap out on, or I can't cheap myself out on.
I think I always have that innate aversion to mysticism, but I think that so this is just a feeling that I have, you know. Durkheim was a sociologist.
Oh no.
And he didn't think of religion as something inherently spiritual. He thought of it as a kind of social practice which distinguishes between sacred and profane things.
Yes, and do you know why? Because he had a Whiggish, maybe that's inappropriate in this context, but he had what I would call a Whiggish view of religion that treated Christian forms as essentially an evolution of previous forms, like purely positive ones. So it's not just a matter of it's unique, it's unique and it's a development off of older forms of religion. And so he conceived of religion in totemic ways, because this was a common feature between Christian social forms and the social forms of other cultures. But all he ended up doing is, like, he even goes as far as to, like, characterize a church as a universal category that you can find in every single society. Durkheim's bad. I mean, like, he's important in the history of sociology, but his theoretical framework is hopelessly fraught.
Things, a sort of collective group ritualization.
Yes.
Yeah, it can be football. It doesn't have to be anything that's necessarily religious. So in that sense, I think religiosity is all around us. There's mysticism I tend to be disfavorable towards because to me it's inextricable from a lot of, and I'm sure you have similarly bad opinions of what Christianity has done to it. Right.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I see what stuff like that can do, but what you're describing past the mysticism, what I see in it, at least this is just my opinion, is a kind of cultural religiosity in the Durkheimian sense, where we're talking about rituals and practices that we engage in that can connect us to a country, to the land, to a community, whether or not you believe in the spiritualism. So, for
Absolutely.
example, depending on where you live in, like for example, in Los Angeles, this sounds really, really like trivial in comparison, but one.
Okay, again, like, Durkheim is trying to understand the ontology of religion. He's not interested in beliefs, because the ontology of religion as a thing separate from individuals is not predicated on individual belief. It's predicated on, in sociological terms, it's predicated on things around which communities are oriented in fact, things which determine their movements and their dynamics.
One of the things that Los Angeles are really happy about is our street tacos, or like any kind of street food that you can get. Depending on where you are in LA, it can be amazing. And people will talk about undergoing the process of experiencing that in a way which, while not as significant, feels to me similar to what you're describing, which is there's something locked within the land and the community in a place. And
That's
whether
right, yeah.
right, and you can connect to that. And I do feel more connected to LA when I do stuff like that than when I do what I do most of the time, which is sit at home, play video games. You know, that doesn't
Now,
give me that profound
yeah,
sense of connection.
It is important to distinguish between myself and other Indigenous people in this regard, because most other Indigenous people that I know personally actually do not feel the way that I feel about it. Most Indigenous people that I've met who, the way that we phrase it, who are walking the red path, we're following the very spiritual path, and engaging with the mysticism and so on and so forth, they don't feel the same way that I do. And in fact, they're they're very, very protective of whatever mysticism is available to them in those cultural practices. And I think that's fine too. People are allowed to engage with spirituality, with mysticism if they want. That's their right. Um, but I don't personally, and I think that's an important distinction to make here because that's one of the ways in which I do not represent a large portion of Indigenous people. You know, many Indigenous people feel very strongly about these spiritual practices because they, you know, in the same way that people go to church and pray and really feel something from praying and not necessarily um from going to church, but in prayer specifically, like they feel something from that.
Uh-huh.
That's something that I don't have because I don't believe that there's a big man in the sky watching over me. And because I don't believe there's a big man in the sky watching over me, I can't get on board with every and all spiritual practice that's available to me as an Indigenous person.
Can I ask you then what you think about my perspective on this?
Well, I don't think it's an unreasonable perspective. I think everybody has the right to decide their own, um, you know, to self actualize their own beliefs. But I wonder, I really think that, you know, out of everything that we've been doing to shit all over Native people, I think that trying to tell them that you know, their goofy hijinks is a little too out there is probably, it's just not the right time. You know, give them the land back and then start taxing some people. And then maybe it's time to open up a better discourse about whether or not their kooky shenanigans are
Let their
appropriate or
Yeah,
inappropriate.
let them become a powerful magnate, you know, with
Yeah,
yeah, two-thirds of the world's oil controlled in their territory, and then we can
that's right.
would I
Especially
oh
because
sorry.
yeah, if you think about if you think about Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the largest resources that we have available to people suffering from addiction.
Mhm.
But there are people who are left out of Alcoholics Anonymous because they're not on board with the religion.
I'm gonna be honest, this is very boring. This is extremely boring. Like, she's okay. Morgan is okay. This is probably a useful conversation, minus the weird, invidious shots at Professor Flowers early on. But this is just so boring. Like, all I'm getting from this is really, like, boring lay sociology. And stuff I think everybody knows already for the most part. I mean, apparently not. Dr. Heimdall was like on an alien planet, but this is just. This is tedious.
Religious dogmatism that's included in one of those steps, right?
Yeah.
And it's a similar thing with Indigenous culture. If you deny Indigenous people the right to participate in that mysticism, you're going to inevitably hurt some of the people who are most at risk in suffering from addiction, in suffering from abuse, neglect, and any of the traumas that have been trickling down upon us. And
You know why this is boring? It's because the question originally, like the one posed by Professor Flowers, or I rather should say, the questions posed to Professor Flowers, were interesting because they actually dealt with things that are real and independent of feelings, right? It wasn't a question of like, oh, what things can, what attitudes or what portrayals or whatnot are quote unquote effective, or what like has good uptake amongst people who have no power or inclination to assist you anyways, like things like that. It had to do with the nature of like what is a community? How high can a community be valued? What are like the existential stakes involved? in quote unquote maintaining a space in any respect. Stuff like that is interesting. Now we're on this like this super milquetoast train about like the emotional benefits of religious practice or something, and I'm just dear God, this is so dull. It's all been kind of replaced with random Twitter views. Yeah, I agree, Frackle.
That mysticism really helps our communities and keeps the bond really strong, and I think is a cause for good in the long run. But I should hope that as time goes on, I get to one day meet more Indigenous people like myself who are a little too pragmatic.
I don't think there's much left. Let's see, we're at 2 minutes and 32 seconds. Sorry, 2 hours and 32 minutes. And then it looks like there's like 20 somewhat minutes left, because when he goes into big screen, that's when he's not talking to people, right?
For their own good.
Okay, I think I totally get that. It feels to me a little bit like almost like my feeling on Mecca in a way, right? Like I'm not I'm not Muslim.
Oh.
You can like Google Mecca and there are people.
God, I legitimately heard him say MECHA.
Doing, you know, big circles around it, and I don't get it. And
Oh, yeah.
honestly, I don't care.
Barely awake
But
right now.
if someone like bombed Mecca, I would be outraged on behalf of them.
Yeah.
Because
Just make sure they're not made of Gundanium alloy.
even if I don't think there's any relationship between that box and the metaphysical, I do think that it's enormously important to people. And even if I sometimes just don't believe in it, sometimes outright disagree with some of the spiritualism associated with it, that doesn't change the fact that, I mean, whether religion is a part of it or not, you know, things have been important to people for as long as people have been around, and I think it's worthwhile to fight for.
Okay, I think that the Kaaba is actually the head of a giant mech that's been buried beneath the surface of the earth since before mankind evolved.
For those things.
I agree. And I think one of the issues too, going back to talking about, you know, one of the reasons.
And that Islam was originally a plan by the ancients to rob the power of that godlike Mecca by removing the talismans that powered its consciousness from inside of it.
Reasons why you don't see a lot of engagement in debating from a lot of Indigenous people, or the people that you do hear it from seem really reasonable and really, you know, on point, is because we know that this aspect to our society is super off-putting to especially the left. You know, especially to people who are secular, especially to people who think that the church should be dismantled, which I would love to see. But, you know, like, it's a really hard sell to those people when you say, yeah, I'm Native and I want the land back and everything like that. They're like, yeah. And then you're like, also, I think we should be allowed to, you know, do our spiritual things in the way that we want to do them. And people are like, wait. Spiritual things? Like God and whatever? And you're like, yeah, some of us want to do that. Is that okay? And they're like, oh, I mean, I guess, I don't know. It's kind of icky.
Right, to a lot of people, it delegitimizes a claim.
That's
which,
right.
In a way that it wouldn't if we were talking about another religious group, maybe. Like, if we were talking about, like, Christians here in America, and they're like, yeah, we really care about this place because this is where, you know, this guy, I don't know anything about Christianity. I think we would assign, like, more...
Finally, something we agree on.
...meaning to their, to the mysticism associated with their claim than we do to a lot of natives.
I think the reason for that is because Christianity and Catholicism in general are the type of mysticism that is most commonly accepted in our society. You know, when somebody, like, think about somebody making a toast at dinner. How utterly offended would you actually be if somebody was like, thank God for these two people getting married today. Hear ye,
Like
right?
zero.
You
Like not.
you
Yeah.
don't
Like
think anything of it, right?
Yeah.
You don't think anything of it. But when a Native person is in a similar circumstance in front of a group of white people or secular people and raises their glass and says, "In the great Gitche Manitou, we trust. Thank you so much for this unification." People are like, "What the fuck's Gitche Manitous? That's some weird Native weirdo
they would be
stuff."
loading their muskets.
I think it's actually there's two things going on there, and this is actually sort of a good point. I think that the terms God and things like that are so denuded of, so emptied of content, that when people say these things, like people say "oh my God" just casually all the time, right? Like it's ubiquitous, and it's a part of the hegemony of a certain culture. But at the same time, I'm talking about like English culture, just to be clear. I'm not dog whistling. It's part of the hegemony of a particular like set of cultural institutions. They're so embedded that we don't even think anything of them. So when they're said, they have no. There's nothing in them to offend us because there's nothing in them. Whereas that's not the case for Gitche Manitou or things like that, because they're not hegemonic. And so when someone says that, they're not simply like, they're not using it. It can't be construed or even just generally treated as a figure of speech, even if it is, because it seems to come with some positive content that is alien. It's still unfair, but
Before they finish
Yeah.
the pledge. Yeah. No, I
So,
completely get that. It's cultural
sort of like
Christianity.
yeah, they hear the spiritual religiosity of it, and they're like, "Oh, that's that weird stuff that I don't like, that I recognize," but they don't get the Christian sense of it that they do recognize, and therefore are feeling even more separated from it.
Yeah. It's the I don't believe in a God, but Jesus is the God I don't believe in.
Yeah,
Where
that's right.
right. Like I celebrate Christmas. I'm not Christian. I've never been Christian. I celebrate Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
When I see Christmas trees all up over the place, I don't even think about it. It's practically secularized. At least it is to me. Christian people don't
Yeah.
secularize it. They care a whole hell of a lot about, what was it, the day Christ died? Or was that Easter? No, that was when he was born. He was born on Christmas.
Yeah,
right?
and Easter he rose again. Christmas he was born.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
clearly there's a bias in the extent to which we're off put by spiritualism we don't believe in, depending on whether
Yeah.
it comes from hegemonically Christian groups or
yeah,
Native
they're right
groups,
on
I
this
think.
point.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true for certain. Yeah. One of the other issues that I wanted to bring up as well was so
Another tangent.
let's go back to talking about the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and
I
how
love
that
talking about
affected and how that affected indigenous indigenous issues. So on the one hand, when Black Lives Matter started gaining some traction, there was
Oh, what's going on?
around the same time we were all making the case to change the Washington football logo and team name from its
Oh, did the stream
incredibly
end? I wonder if the stream
offensive,
ended and that's what's going on. There's a super chat here. Not mine, unfortunately. Professor Flowers putting genocide on the table on quote-unquote behalf of indigenous people reminds me a lot of anarchist white boys antagonizing cops at BLM protests, acting like they're doing black people a favor. She didn't put genocide on the table. I don't know why people keep saying this. This was put on the table by other people, and she didn't respond in a way that they liked. I didn't like the response either, but that's beside the point. She did not put that on the table.
that I have been staring at as an indigenous person my entire life to something that, you know, maybe didn't shit all over
Here,
Native
let's
people.
turn the quality down a bit.
And part of that happened because there was a rising in social awareness as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, because, you know, people were starting to see like, oh, you know, if people are making some noise about something, they're not just going to go away. They're just going to kind of get like really big and like make a lot of noise and stuff. And so maybe we should just, you know, nip this Washington thing in the bud and just change the logo, which is great. But on the other hand, especially in Canada, which is a little bit more removed from Black Lives Matter than America is, at the same time that Black Lives Matter was starting to gear up, there was something happening up here with a reservation being built up. They were building a pipeline through it, which is a big no-no, obviously, you would fucking think. And it was called We Stand with Wet'suwet'en. And at the time, it was almost completely obliterated in the media because it just could not compare with the wave that was Black people coming together to start, you know, bringing this issue to light. And we just got completely lost in the rhetoric, just absolutely drowned out. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that we should be uplifting each other as much as possible. But I do also want to point out that it's often...
God, what is up with...
I just...
Sorry, I'm not worried about my connection. It's YouTube's connection. For some reason, it seems to be stopping to buffer constantly.
I'm trying to understand why it is that there are minorities who are...
It might actually be my connection now. I think the stream just died for a brief second. Are we still on? Anyways, this is getting kind of tedious, so I'm not going to continue with this. How long have we been going for? It's been almost 2 hours. Let's see, where are we at now? Oh yeah, like we're 5 minutes to 2 hours, good god. We should probably finish it. There's not much left. It's like 20 minutes. We should just do it. I think Vaush is still alive. He usually goes pretty long. And it seems like it's still moving forward. He has like a ton of super chats to do still. But for whatever reason, the connection's fizzling out a little bit.
In a position of authority and power over Indigenous people seem to want to really ignore that and don't want to speak to that and don't want to say that that's happening.
The imbalanced allocation of social capital.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yes. So, like for instance, you know, like Black culture is huge in America. It's enormous in America. It's not as big in Canada.
It's like the only culture we have, actually. Wait.
Tractor King asks, Sunday, how much credit do we give you here? Why does everyone hear genocide endorsement from PF where you don't? Are you the chosen one? What is it that only you know? Apparently, I'm the only one who listens to what people actually say. Like, I'm as stumped as you are. I'm a little bit baffled by how stupid everyone is being about this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Indigenous culture, even if you think about what you see in the media, is a smidgen of that. It's just a pittance compared to Black culture's, you know, big beautiful Blackness, which we love. But it does undercut, you know, sometimes issues for Indigenous people. And again, it's not that that's a bad thing, but in the case of somebody like Professor Flowers, oh my goodness, can you not understand how sometimes not good it looks to be a minority in a position of greater like social capital than Indigenous communities, and then using Indigenous talking points to try and justify, you know, your own ends? I just...
She didn't do that. Dr. Heemdout did that. She did nothing of the sort. She talked about Black communities should be allowed to have Black-only spaces where they can be away from societies that historically oppressed them, or from their oppressors in her specific terminology. And then the Indigenous case was brought up as a counterexample, like, do they have the right to expel colonizers from their territory? That was not her. She's being blamed again for what other people have tabled. Like, I feel like I'm in an insane asylum. Like, this was on video, right? Like, we have this on record. We literally have a foolproof record of what was said. Are we deaf and blind? Like, are we insane? Have you heard genocide endorsement? You were only listening to Vaush or Heme and not Flowers herself. I wouldn't go that far. Like, I don't think they were endorsing genocide. They were arguably tacitly doing an apologia for an ongoing cultural genocide at a level of analysis that, frankly, I can't fault them for not being sensitive towards, because almost nobody is. But, like, this is literally just attributing to one member of a conversation what the other person actually said. This is actually insane. They only listen to the commentary about it. These people, like, no, I think these people actually watched it. But it's like losing a game of telephone when it's just one person. Like, this is actually nuts, guys. I covered that conversation myself on stream, and I wasn't even like particularly kind to Professor Flowers. I critiqued her heavily. Like, by the way, Professor Flowers doesn't even like to watch my stuff on this, because I'm not I'm not like a Flowers simp. I critique her in almost every case where I discuss this topic. I've done so in this video. Watching and actively listening are two different things. No, it's worse than that, because it's not like people are just not paying attention to the conversation and then they just hear reads of the conversation as a meme and then just sort of roll with that. It's they clearly heard the conversation because they're taking content from it, but then they're attributing the arguments of one party to the opposite party that didn't say them. Like,
I really had a problem with that. That was the point where I was like yelling at the TV while I was watching it, and I went and grabbed my laptop and emailed you. I was like, no, this needs to get sorted out. This can't happen. No.
The thing that's been really frustrating is that outside of, well, I guess my community, which is admittedly pretty large, so that means something, but outside of that, the left mostly seem to side with Professor Flowers.
I was really shocked, yeah,
by
to
default,
see that.
yeah. I think part of it is just
not by default. You guys did a really, and by you guys I mean Vaush and Dr. Heemdout, and I don't have generally a lot of actual issues with Vaush. They did a really, really, really bad job of conducting those conversations in a way that actually took their interlocutor to task for things they were actually proposing. And instead they were perfectly happy to allow a nervous conversation partner without a moderator who has to juggle like a ton of different things with a vastly smaller audience. They were perfectly content to take any slip up or any failure to portray in the most effective way possible. They were perfectly happy to take that as a license and as a launching pad to just destroying them socially. And by the way, everybody who was being represented by the topics that they were discussing. Like, Heemdout was not kosher on land back. Heemdout was perfectly fine to treat land back as genocidal, and Professor Flowers didn't push back hard enough on that construal. Maybe she did and I'm forgetting. But she didn't introduce that comparison. And Vaush was the one who was really, really forcing the idea of black-only spaces being inherently genocidal. Like, here's a crazy idea. You can take everything that Professor Flowers said, come to the conclusion practically that establishing black-only spaces would result in genocide, and therefore it shouldn't be done practically, but also they should be able to do it normatively. Like, these aren't contradictory. Flowers didn't do good in the decolonialism segment, but people are still misrepresenting her positions. I think some of that is due to white fragility. Like, here's the thing. If you're going to be like a political advocate of this scale, I'm not just talking to Vaush, I'm talking to anyone. You know, presumably, one of your goals is not to hurt a lot of the people that you're advocating for. And that's what these interactions did. Like, what, does she have to be an expert on everything and she has to be completely 100% optically pure in order to not throw every single person who identifies as a black nationalist under the bus or a black separatist under the bus? Because those people aren't all bigots.
Like, on the left, we tend to just defer to minority voices, like whether or not
Yeah.
they're correct, and I am a white boy.
A faulty narrative was erected in the first convo that she'd okayed ethnic cleansing / genocide that just continuously gets taken as fact. She actually explicitly in that conversation said that genocide is a thing that you can't do. This being addressed to colonized peoples. That's a thing you can't do. She stresses that the attempt to create a black-only space need not always culminate in genocide, and she does this with the unstated assumption, but it is actually stated later on, that this is because genocide is bad. She never makes an apology for genocide. Ever. Ever.
And I think part of it is probably a bias against me, which I'll accept. But I honestly, I think a lot of it... Okay, maybe you can tell me if you think I'm
No, let's go
overstepping
there,
with
yeah.
this. Honestly, I think a lot of people on the left feel unironic, conservative, stereotyped white guilt. I think they recognize that they're the benefactors of a very destructive power hierarchy, and rather than, like, address that in, like, a responsible or holistic way, instead what they do is they absorb all of the liberal, like, fear-mongering over
Yeah.
fear of
You
retribution.
mean,
I feel zero guilt whatsoever. None. Political sovereignty is established by who can assert power within a given territory, and that is the source of political right, and that's that. However, the ethic that is established by that community also bears on me, and by failing to uphold our own values and treat other human beings as human beings, and our failure to uphold our own treaties, we violate our own ethic. So no, I don't feel guilty, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our communities don't have duties, right? That's what this comes down to. Feelings do not matter here. That is completely immaterial. And I think a lot of people recognize that. I don't think people have reacted to this because they're just reflexively pitying of black people in particular and don't take those claims seriously.
And they
Do
go,
you mean
yeah,
like,
actually.
do you mean like those white people in the latest Channel 5 news with Andrew Callahan who were literally just giving money to Saddam, the black co-host, because he was at their rally for reparations
I
for
haven't
black
seen
people?
that, but if that's what
Oh my
happens, I
gosh,
know what I'm
that's what
watching as
happened,
we're done with
right?
this stream.
That's what
Yes!
happened, man.
The Uhuru Yes!
That's right.
This guy,
yeah.
Gazi
You mean like
Kotso.
that?
He tried to come on my stream once, but this dude is a hardcore grifter, so I don't know. He just wants attention. I should have done it anyway. He's good memes. Yeah,
Yeah.
white people show up at this shit, and there's they have like a payment system on their website where they're like, yeah, you know, if you're white, this is the first step to fixing racism. Okay, you gotta go sign up for the white boy pledge.
Actually, I chatted to Vaush on in his GG chat prior to this conversation happening, because I had planned to like cover this conversation. Somewhat regret it now, but I was planning to cover the conversation, and she wasn't showing up. So I was like, "Can someone tap her shoulder? Like, can we get something on?" And in the course of that, I asked like, "Hey, did you survive my soul-crushing critique of all of your sins?" Well, and he said, "No, he hasn't actually seen it yet." So I like that he's going to watch it in private, because he said he doesn't want to watch it on stream because he'll speed through it, and I like that. And I'm cautiously optimistic that that actually has some kind of positive uptake, because I was very careful with that one, and I think that one was very important. And frankly, like, if he would really impress me, like to an insane degree, if he engaged with that in a serious way. But we'll see. I've been disappointed before, so yeah. I don't agree with Professor Flowers because I have quote-unquote guilt. I agree with her because she gives the actual nuance of the situation with which Vaush is muddying with his own ignorance. Yeah, I think she's generally correct. Like, there are bits there that are iffy, but I think the overall thrust of her arguments is sound, and I think she's fairly level. I don't think engaging in like these optical minefields is her forte, but that is not the be-all end-all of intelligence. In fact, a lot of really, really unintelligent people are very good at that. And I really dislike a lot that she's been raked over the coals for that.
It's
Yeah.
like aliens.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's great. It's great. They did a little expose on it where they were like, so anyway, these guys took the money and then they went and built a basketball court in like Saint somewhere on the other side of the country and shit, and like, how is that benefiting people in Oakland, Oklahoma, wherever it was?
the dudes they're doing this for, those Gazi Kotso guys, I think they're basically Nazis. They're like really anti-Semitic, and they're like reverse Nazis. There's, you know, it's like all the tropes and talking points, just flipping the script on who's the benefactor, and who's the But But no, I unfortunately, and there's no way for me to say this without sounding like conservative. I mean, I'm literally like sitting here like, you lefties are full of white guilt, but I honestly think that
I think
gets
there's a
in
lot
the
of
way.
Yeah.
It hurts.
There's a lot of it.
The advocacy.
And I find that it goes two ways. That
What is he basing this off of? Like, she's kind of a yes girl, so I don't know if that has connotations that are different from yes man, but she's just not like there's no content on her end here. But where is he getting this idea? Like, people have made like specific pointed criticisms of his treatment of Professor Flowers. Why would he refer that all to white guilt? For that matter, like why does he think that the majority of his critics are even, I guess, well, I mean, statistically they're probably white, but I don't know. This is just like, come on, man, really? You're just making it difficult for me.
it's, you know, either you start to feel like a shitty person for being white, and you start to think like, oh my god, you know, all these things are happening and I'm having a good time, and that's kind of messed up. And you either go like super hard rad liberal, or you go super hard conservative, because you can either deny what is happening and the icky gross feelings that you're feeling, or they just lean way too hard on the opposite end of the spectrum and think that they have to flagellate themselves in order to get the point across. I just think it's such a disservice that don't be afraid to talk to people. Don't be afraid to talk to minorities like they're on your level. Like, stop trying to divide yourself from them. And that goes everywhere. I get that black people especially have a long, hard past behind them, between them and white people, and that makes them unwilling or nearly unable to effectively, engage with white people. I get that. Okay, I really do. And to express how I get that, let me explain something to you.
Oh, don't
Even though
explain
I am
something.
half white, I am still fucking half native, and there are still people in my country who would have no problem saying to my face that they think I should get run over if I'm protesting on a highway. They have no problem calling me a dirty fucking native. They have no problem.
P.S. This is unrelated, but Sunday, do you have a preference between channel membership versus Patreon? Channel membership is cheaper, and I was originally going to do like membership only things, and I'm still trying to work out how to do that in a way that's effective, because there's not a lot of you, so it's like, okay, I'm going to be basically running streams with no audience that other people can't partake in unless they want money, and that's just going to make people feel bad. So I haven't been plugging the memberships. If you want to support the channel, Patreon actually goes to me, whereas the memberships are like pennies. So like, it's really up to you. If you, I'm grateful for whatever you can do, and frankly, even just watching the videos helps engagement and helps the channel grow, yada yada yada. But you know, whatever suits you. I do, however, give you like concrete perks for like supporting on Patreon though, so that's something to consider.
Problem making all and any kind of assumption about me based off of my background. They have no problem treating me differently. Nothing. No fucks given. So I get that in the long history of dealing with shit
This is a Vaush React channel now. I don't do a lot of Vaush reactions. They're just talking about something that's been sort of like in the general discourse lately.
every day from white people, you are disinclined to engage with them. But the truth of the matter is, we're all adults now. This is not kindergarten anymore. You have to accept that we live on this planet with people we think
She knows she's talking to Vaush's audience, right? I think the median age there is like 17 or 16.
are fucking assholes. And at one point or another, you're going to have to figure out a productive way to engage with these people, because if you don't, if you leave them to their own devices, they're just going to get worse, and they're just going to make more problems for you in the long run.
Oh, I completely agree.
Professor Flowers was not hostile to people for the most part. In fact, I think the worst thing she did, and I actually have a lot of respect for this, I don't think this was bad at all, but like the nastiest, shall we say, construable thing that she did was on her Patreon after she got a bunch of attention from Vaush. She was like, guys, if you like support Vaush's rhetoric on these issues and his treatment of me or what have you, please take your money elsewhere. Which I think is a tremendously honorable thing to do. That's literally saying, don't pay me on principle. I have tremendous respect for that. And she talks to people. She talks to white people productively all the time. I've not had a negative interaction with her yet. I don't feel like I'm being spoken to disrespectfully at all. I don't know where this is coming from. I feel like these people had like some negative interactions at university or on Twitter or something, and they're just projecting that onto every person they meet that vaguely, superficially fits the bill according to some rubric.
The people who I like, the frustration I have most here is with the self-hating white groups, because in my experiences, like doing activism work or talking with like BLM people or going outside and talking to real human beings who don't live on Twitter, it's that overwhelmingly, I think that like the vast majority of like indigenous people have good, maybe like not perfectly politically cogent opinions. That's not everyone
Right.
can have those, but for the most part, like a good set of opinions on these issues, and black people with theirs and so on. Again, not perfect, just generally I think that they're not on Twitter, and that's their benefit. The issue is that there's this performative need to distance yourself from any semblance of chauvinism on the left, which leads to men being constant apologists for themselves, or like they're always like, sorry for being a guy, cis people do this, white people do this. And what that means is that you encourage an atmosphere not of anti-racism or anti-sexism, but rather of who has the most performatively anti-hegemonic oppressive opinion perspective.
I haven't seen any of this with respect to the Professor Flowers issue, like, at all. Like, none. 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 Where is this coming from? I guess like the Bad Mouse video was kind of grasping, but like I haven't seen anything outside of that. I didn't like the Bad Mouse critique, by the way. There were problems with that one. I'm not like a massive fan of Demon Mama generally, but I think she was on point in her critique of that one. At least for the most part.
And what that means is you get perspectives like, actually, we should kick all white people out of America, no matter how stupid or unproductive or antithetical it actually is to native groups. So
no, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
I don't know.
And let me also say, like, as an indigenous person, I'm so exhausted by seeing that rhetoric, like the amount.
Okay, well, she's joking, right? Like, as an indigenous person, but why is she getting this audience here specifically to talk about this? Like like it's like specifically, frankly, because she's an indigenous advocate. I'm not sure what that means, but okay, activist, something like that. And she is discussing something that is salient, indigenous land back movements. Because they were brought up by Professor Flowers. So it's like, I'm the one being misrepresented here, something like that. Like that is what she's doing objectively. Like, I'm not down on her for it, but I wonder if there's something more insidious happening with this line of thinking. Not intentional, perhaps, but this messaging suggests that anyone who does agree with Flowers is only doing so irrationally out of white guilt or something. Yeah, that's exactly what it's implying. I really resent that. I don't know how much I would attribute to, like, intentional malice here. I don't think very much, but I had very specific reasons for agreeing with Professor Flowers on that. I think a lot of people did. I think a lot of people got it. And I didn't agree with Professor Flowers just across the board, but the general points being made I agreed with. And I had serious issues with how her interlocutors treated her and how they portrayed the issue that they were discussing. For specific reasons that I've given ad nauseum by this point. I don't think I'm a genius. I think a lot of people had similar thoughts as me on that. So I really don't appreciate being thrown under the bus here, because I'm only agreeing with Professor Flowers, of course, because I'm just pathetic in my soul, and I just feel guilty and like I need to atone or something like that. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Sorry, I don't like rude comments like that. Who watches The Watchmen? I'm not particularly sensitive, but that's gross.
Amount of stuff. I'm a little anachronistic. I still like scroll on Facebook. I don't know how to use TikTok. Like I don't know those stuff. So
Keep
you
it
know, you get a lot of those pictures that come through on the feed or whatever, and they're always white people posting, which I appreciate the engagement, but it's always white people posting, you know, stuff like the bodies are piling up still underneath the churches, and the government of Canada is mean to Native people. And it's like, yes, it's true, and I'm happy that you're engaging, but I'm tired. You know, I see it every day in my life, and I don't need to watch the kindergartners come in with picket signs in order for me to know what's wrong with my society. And I feel bad because I want to help, you know, I want to be nice, and I want to be like, yeah, your heart's in the right place, but half of the time I just want to take them and say, shut up, just go do something, go bake a cake, you know, go make some bagels, I don't know, learn to sew, do something else with your time other than putting all of this emotional energy into reminding me that I still don't get to live in a fair society.
Do you think it's like do you think it's kind of like a like a virtue signal thing, where you think that it's mostly being invoked because it's part of a broader package of like self-identifying as a progressive, and the reason they post
Pathetic soul indulgence tax. Thank you, Dietrich.
it has more to do
Some
with.
people it is.
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
met people like that, and it's so toxic. I had to unfollow. I had a really good friend that she is still a nice person, but the rhetoric is just so toxic because she's more concerned about getting everything perfectly 100% right than she is in being a reasonable human being.
Hang on, is she talking about Professor Flowers? I missed that.
It's in the right place, but I don't know how to use TikTok. Like, I don't know about
Based.
those stuff. So,
Keep
you
it up.
know, you get a lot of those pictures that come through on the feed or whatever, and they're always white people posting, which I appreciate the engagement, but it's always white people posting, stuff like the bodies are piling up still underneath the churches, and the government of Canada is mean to Native people. And it's like, yes, it's true, and I'm happy that you're engaging, but I'm tired. I'm tired.
I don't think that's really for your benefit specifically. Like, this is all cumulative. Um, like, the Canadian state does have an outstanding debt of wrong to Indigenous groups. Like, imagine one day your kid's at the park, and then they just never come home, and you never get closure your entire life. Why? Because they were just picked up, and nobody thought that you deserved to be notified or asked, and you just never see your kid again. Why? Because they took no contact information. So when they died of tuberculosis, as many kids did back then, admittedly, like in residential schools, even ones where they weren't taken by force, they didn't notify the parents because they didn't know who the parents were. And so generations go by. And you have families who have lost children and they never know what happened to them. And now all of a sudden we're digging up graves under schools. That's really dark. That is really dark. Why does she think they're trying... Why does she... Sorry. I'm so out of it, guys. Why does she think they're trying to make that message for her? Doesn't it take white allies to talk about decolonization in order for Indigenous issues to be given awareness in mainstream society? Well, I think that is the manifestation of Indigenous issues having uptake in mainstream society. But moreover, it's like... I guess my question is, why are you trying to demoralize this? Without, like... And her alternative is go bake a cake and go smell the flowers or something. Like... I mean, the church has been genociding for a long time. This actually wasn't the church in this case. This was the Canadian state, which basically allowed church members to do the job for them. But ultimately, this was explicit by the Canadian government. They wanted to assimilate Native children into the mainstream population, break up Indigenous communities, and dissolve them. And so they wanted to put them into a schooling system that would, make them literate, specifically English speaking, and basically educate them to be part of the culture of the state and not part of the culture of their families. They just didn't really care a whole lot to do that safely, or leaving aside the fact that at the end of the day they were still stealing people's children. They did a crappy job of it. There was no oversight, and you basically had God knows who with absolute power over children in isolation somewhere with no way for them to appeal to the outside for help. Like, it was a disaster in the making. That actually has so little to do with the church, it's not even funny. The main thing there is a general lack of oversight and care combined with an extremely cruel and arrogant and callous attitude by the government and policies therefrom. And by the church too, like to be fair, like the church was not responsible either, but that's something else. I mean, it's not entirely something else, but you know what I mean. I'm not simping for the church. I'm not a Catholic, and I have a lot of issues with the Catholic Church. I just think in this particular case, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to characterize this as another instance of the church genociding, primarily because what it actually does is buries the actual fact of the case, which is this is another case of the nice, benign Canadian government genociding.
I see it every day in my life, and I don't need to watch the kindergartners come in with picket signs in order for me to know
get to the
what's
point.
wrong
I hate looking at
society.
VODs like this because it's so
And I feel
slow.
bad because I want to help, I want to be nice, and I want to be like, yeah, your heart's in the right place, but half of the time I just want to take them and say, shut up, just shut up, just go do something, go bake a cake, go make some bagels, I don't know, learn to sew, do something else with your time other than putting all of this emotional energy into reminding me that I still don't get to live in a fair society.
Do you think it's like do you think it's kind of like a
Oh my God,
like
buffer
a virtue
already.
signal thing, where you think that it's mostly being invoked because it's part of a broader package of like self-identifying as a progressive, and the reason they post it has more to
Some
do with
people it is.
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
met people like that, and it's so toxic. I had to unfollow. I had a really good friend that
Oh
she
my
is still a
God,
nice
what is
person,
wrong with
but
this?
the rhetoric is just so toxic because she's more concerned about getting everything perfectly 100% right than she is in being a reasonable human being who's capable of having a nuanced fucking discussion about politics. I just can't.
No, I understand what you mean.
Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. I think most of the time it is just people, they want to.
Okay, this is getting really basic and annoying. Like, we get the point. This is stupid. No, people were not disagreeing with Vaush's and Dr. Heimdall's approaches to Professor, I almost called her Dr. Flowers, to Professor Flowers because they have white guilt. They did so because they watched a patently unfair and loaded discussion throw a ton of people under the bus and characterize them unfairly as Nazis and characterize Professor Flowers as an ethno-nationalist with a tendency to promoting genocide, which is patently false. I'm just embarrassed for this, honestly. This is... like, Vaush isn't stupid enough to get a pass on this, and I don't think Morgan is either. This is just the height of carelessness, and it's really frustrating. Like, I don't think this is deliberate. I think this is just, like, sheer laziness. Sheer laziness and just, like, a complete willingness to just let all standards fall through the floor so long as you get approval by the big audience. It's just damn disappointing. Anyways, I really hope, I'm probably naive in this, but I really hope that when Vaush actually looks at my critique specifically, there's some kind of uptake. This is like degenerating into a farce. I can't watch this anymore. I don't even know why I watched it this far. This is just painfully boring. I think you'll agree. Alright, what are we doing going forward? I'm having conversations about Dune soon with woke Mr. Medicare, aka Bunnytooth, who doesn't have a channel but probably should. Soon. So that'll be interesting. We're going to be getting into the deep stuff. There's not a whole lot of content to cover right now, is there? Like, it's actually kind of a struggle to find stuff that's interesting. Everybody's just kind of circling the drain. Right. If you were watching the announcement for this stream earlier today, you might have noticed for like a few seconds it switched to something else. either tomorrow evening or the night after that, I'm going to be covering a conversation that took place a little while ago. But it's a doozy between James Lindsay and Stephen Hicks on the seeds of collectivism. And that one's going to be fun. For me anyways. I like picking them apart like the wings off insects. It gives me joy. Yeah, this was embarrassing. I am like, look, Morgan made a bunch of good points. Not super interesting points, but good points. But she also threw in a bunch of invidious remarks that not only were uncalled for, but directly contradicted the actual case of events. We're not even talking about, like, misinterpreting these interactions. They literally attributed statements and moves made by Dr. Heemdout to Professor Flowers. Yeah, exactly. James Lindsay, inventor of hyperrealism and German idealism, in fact. Goddamn, even Mr. Medicare would be more intellectually honest about the whole Professor Flowers versus Vaush drama than this display of cacophony. Mr. Medicare is an extremely crass and often callous man, except in certain cases. Namely, anything involving children or animals. I actually have like some degree of respect for him for that, because he goes hard on people who are cruel to either of those, or who are dangerous to either of those. But my general impression of him is that he is a real person, and he's like there, and he means what he says. That's not always a good thing. But do I think he would have treated this honestly? I don't know if he treated fairly, but I think he treated honestly, and this was dishonest. There's no way around it. Do I think they were deliberately lying? No. But you know what? I think falsely portraying something as if you were recalling it correctly, that gets in the ballpark to me. Check out the channel called Thoughts on Thinking. Why, what do they do? Someone's mentioned it to me before. If I'm going to cover something, I don't want it to be like an hour of me just going, yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's sort of right. That's sort of right. And just having nothing else to contribute, you know? Like, that's boring. It either has to be really bad so I can launch off and, like, do a better job, or a good job. Or it has to be something really interesting. One of those things. Otherwise, like, I'd rather just read, you know? Or do literally anything else. Because that's boring for you guys, and it does nothing for me. But yeah, hey, I have a content suggestions channel on my Discord. By all means, it saves me time. If you want to fill that with every little interesting thing you see, be my guest. I scroll through that every day, and it's heavily underutilized. So I would much rather be looking at suggestions by my audience than having to scroll through Vaush's content suggestions, you know? Because I trust my audience more. My audience, I have a very smart audience, I think. They're small, but they're good. Anyways, I think that's pretty good for tonight. I think we're done. I think we saw what we came here to see, and quite a bit more besides that I did not come here to see. It was not that interesting either, so yeah. Thoughts on Thinking is a conspiracy crank who talks about philosophy. Oh, okay, well that could be interesting. Is he big? If it's just like a tiny guy with 1K subs, then what am I doing responding to him? There's a million people like that, you know? Like, that's something else. It has to be like somebody like with reach. Otherwise, you know, it's like I may as well be arguing with a guy on the street with a sign saying the end is nigh, who lives in a shack somewhere. Like, there's just no point. Anyways, I need to sleep so I can do this more, because it never ends. Thanks everybody for listening, or for watching. I'm not running a podcast. Thanks everybody for watching, and have a good night. Take care. Ciao.